March 15th, 1951. Rural Indiana. The postman's boots crunched through lingering snow as he approached the weathered farmhouse, a single envelope clutched in his gloved hand. Caroline Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, watching him navigate the gravel drive. She had watched postmen approach this house for 6 years now, each time with the same flutter of impossible hope in her chest. Her son's war had ended in 1945, but her waiting had never stopped. The knock came soft but certain. Caroline dried her hands on her apron, noting the tremor in her fingers. She opened the door to find Walter Henderson, the same postman who had delivered the telegram in October 1944, the one that had used words like missing in action and presumed killed. His face held an expression she could not immediately decipher. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said quietly, "this came through today. I think you should sit down." The envelope bore her address in handwriting she had memorized from 100 letters written during training, during deployment, during those first months in France. Her son's handwriting. Private Marcus Mitchell, serial number neatly typed beside the return address, American Red Cross, Repatriation Services Division. Caroline's legs found the porch steps without her conscious direction. The envelope felt impossibly light for something that had traveled through 6 years of silence. Walter Henderson stayed, his presence a steadying force, as she turned the envelope over in shaking hands. The letter inside bore a date that made her breath catch. November 3rd, 1944. 4 weeks after the telegram had arrived. 4 weeks after she had begun wearing black. 4 weeks after she had stopped setting a place for him at Sunday dinner. "Dearest Ma," the familiar script began. "I'm writing this from a field hospital somewhere in Belgium, and I need you to know I'm alive." Caroline read the words 3 times before their meaning penetrated the fog of 6 years of grief. Her son had been alive when he wrote this, alive in November 1944. The questions crashed over her like waves. When had he died? Why had the letter taken so long? Had he known she thought him dead? She looked up at Walter Henderson, who nodded slowly. He reached into his postal bag and withdrew a second envelope, this one official, bearing the seal of the United States Army. "This came with it," he said, "an explanation." The Army's letter was typed, formal, apologizing for circumstances beyond their control. Private Marcus Mitchell had been wounded in the Hurtgen Forest on October 17, 1944, evacuated to a field hospital. Listed as missing when his unit was overrun during a German counterattack. The field hospital had been hastily abandoned, medical records scattered, wounded soldiers evacuated in chaos to multiple locations across the European theater. Caroline's hands moved between the 2 letters, unable to reconcile their contradictory realities. The Army explained that Marcus had written the letter during his recovery, entrusted it to a Red Cross volunteer for mailing. But the volunteer's vehicle had been destroyed by artillery fire 2 days later. The mailbag had been recovered from a ditch near Aachen in February 1945, its contents water-damaged but intact, transported to a storage depot, cataloged, forgotten in the chaos of war's end. A routine inventory in 1950 had rediscovered the bag. The Army had spent months verifying addresses, tracking down families, determining which letters still had destinations and which recipients had moved or died in the intervening years. Some letters, the Army explained with bureaucratic regret, bore news that recipients already knew. Some bore news they did not. Caroline forced herself to read her son's words. His handwriting was shakier than usual, evidence of the wounds that had landed him in the hospital. He wrote about the cold Belgian rain, about the medic who had pulled him from the mud, about the nurses who spoke to him in accented English while changing his dressings. He wrote about fear and pain, but also about hope. "The doctor says I'll be going home soon," Marcus had written. "Maybe by Christmas if I'm lucky. Maybe early in the new year if the transport schedules don't cooperate. But I'll be home, Ma. That's what matters. I'll be home." The words cut deeper than any telegram. Caroline stood. walked into the house, retrieved the wooden box from the hall closet. She had not opened it in 2 years. Inside lay the folded flag from the memorial service, the posthumous Purple Heart, the official photograph of her son in uniform, the handful of letters he had sent before going missing. Beneath them all, the telegram that had ended her world. She laid Marcus's new letter beside the telegram, the contradiction stark on her kitchen table. One declared him missing, presumed dead. The other promised his return. Both were 6 years old. Both had arrived too late. Walter Henderson cleared his throat gently. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said, "there's something else in the Army's letter, the second page." Caroline had stopped reading halfway through the first page, unable to process more information. She picked up the official letter again, turned it over, and found her hands had gone numb. The second page explained that Private Marcus Mitchell had recovered from his wounds. He had been transferred through multiple hospitals as the Allies advanced into Germany. His medical records, separated from his person during the chaotic evacuation, had not caught up with him until March 1945. By then, he had been reclassified from missing to wounded, then to recovered, then to active duty with a different unit. He had been part of the forces that liberated a prisoner of war camp near Munich in late April 1945. He had remained in Germany through the summer, part of the occupation forces. He had shipped home in September 1945, arriving at New York Harbor on a crisp autumn day, expecting his mother to be waiting at the train station in Indianapolis. Caroline's vision blurred. The Army's letter continued in its methodical way, explaining what had happened when Marcus returned to find his childhood home empty, sold, his mother gone. The neighbors had told him she had moved to her sister's farm in Indiana after the memorial service. Grief had made the old house unbearable. He had found her, the letter explained, had found her in the winter of 1945, just weeks after his return. Had knocked on the door of this very farmhouse on a cold December evening. The memory crashed over Caroline with physical force. A young man in an Army uniform standing on the porch in the snow, his face so familiar but wrong somehow, aged and weathered. She had thought him a representative from the Army, come to deliver some final piece of paperwork about her dead son. She had invited him in, out of politeness, offered him coffee, waited for him to explain his purpose. She remembered his expression, the way he had looked at her with such intensity, the way he had said, "Ma, it's me," the way she had stared at him, uncomprehending, seeing only a stranger who resembled her son, the way he had repeated it, more desperately. "Ma, it's Marcus, I'm home." Caroline had thought him cruel or mad. What kind of person would impersonate a dead soldier? What kind of sick joke was this? She had asked him to leave, her voice cold with shock and anger. Her sister had emerged from the kitchen, had seen Caroline's distress, had been more forceful in demanding the stranger go. He had left. He had stood on the porch in the falling snow, and he had left. The Army's letter explained the rest in its careful bureaucratic language. Private Marcus Mitchell had returned to active duty in January 1946, unable to convince his family of his identity. The Army had investigated, had confirmed his story, had attempted to contact Caroline through official channels, but she had refused all contact, convinced it was a scam or a case of mistaken identity. The dead did not return. She had buried her son. She had grieved him. She would not be tormented by imposters. Marcus had requested a transfer to the West Coast. He had rebuilt a life in California, the letter explained. He had married in 1947. He had tried 3 more times to contact his mother through the Army, through the Red Cross, through official letters that Caroline had returned unopened, marked with angry notes about frauds and false hopes. The Army's final paragraph was brief. Private Marcus Mitchell, now Mr. Marcus Mitchell civilian, had been located in San Diego. He had been informed that his 1944 letter had finally been delivered. He had authorized the Army to provide his current address and telephone number. The choice of contact, the letter stated with careful neutrality, was entirely Mrs. Mitchell's. Caroline sat at her kitchen table as the March sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows through her windows. The letter from 1944 lay before her. its promise of homecoming 6 years late and 6 years true. She thought of the young man she had turned away in the snow. She thought of his face, the way it had crumpled when she called him a liar. She thought of her son, alive all these years, believing his mother had rejected him. Walter Henderson had left quietly at some point, understanding that some deliveries required solitude. Carolyn picked up the telephone number written at the bottom of the Army's letter. Her hands shook as she dialed, listening to the mechanical clicks and whirs as the connection established itself across 2,000 miles. The phone rang twice. A man's voice answered, cautious and formal. "Mitchell Residence." Caroline's throat closed. She managed 3 words. "Marcus, it's Ma!" The silence on the other end stretched so long, she thought the connection had failed. Then she heard a sound like a sob being swallowed, like 6 years of pain trying to compress itself into a single breath. "Ma," her son said, "you got the letter." They spoke for 2 hours. Caroline learned about her daughter-in-law, Anne, who had never met her but had heard stories. She learned about her grandson, 4 years old, named Thomas after Marcus's father, who had died when Marcus was young. She learned about the life her son had built in the spaces left by war and misunderstanding. Marcus explained what it had been like, trying to prove his identity to people who could not accept that bureaucratic certainty could be wrong. He explained the witnesses he had brought on his second attempt, fellow soldiers who had served with him, who could verify his face, his stories, his scars. None of it had mattered against Carolyn's absolute conviction that her son was dead. "I thought you didn't want me," Marcus said quietly. "I thought maybe I'd changed too much. Maybe I wasn't the son you remembered. Maybe you preferred grief to whatever I'd become." Caroline wept then, the kind of tears that come from a grief so deep it has calcified into permanent weight. She explained about the telegram, about the memorial service, about the finality with which the Army had declared him gone. She explained about the young man on her porch, how she had seen a stranger wearing her son's face, how impossible resurrection had seemed. "They told me you were dead," she said. "They were so certain. How could I believe anything else?" Marcus was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of understanding that came from his own years of war and loss. "You were protecting yourself," he said. "I understand that now. It would have been easier for you if I really was dead. At least then the story would make sense." They made plans. Marcus would bring his family to Indiana in the summer. Caroline would finally meet her daughter-in-law, would hold her grandson for the first time. They would have the reunion that should have happened in 1945, delayed by bureaucracy and trauma, and the unbridgeable gap between official truth and living reality. In the weeks that followed, Caroline found herself rereading the 1944 letter daily. The words had not changed, but their meaning had transformed. What had been a ghost's final message had become a promise kept. Marcus had come home. He had found her. She had simply been too broken to recognize him. She wrote to him twice a week, letters that tried to compress 6 years of missed motherhood into careful script. She learned to use his California address without hesitation, to think of San Diego as a real place her son inhabited rather than an impossible fiction. She sent photographs of the farm, of the changes time had wrought, evidence that life had continued in his absence even if she had not fully inhabited it. Marcus sent photographs in return. Caroline studied the images of her son's face, older now, marked by experiences she would never fully understand. She saw her grandson's smile, Anne's gentle expression, the life Marcus had built, despite everything. She placed these photographs beside the old ones in her wooden box, creating a new narrative that bridged the impossible gap. The explanation, when Caroline finally pieced it together from multiple conversations and Army documents, was almost mundane in its banality. A mailbag destroyed by artillery. Records scattered during a chaotic retreat, a wounded soldier reclassified through multiple hospitals, his paperwork always one step behind his physical location. An Army telegram sent based on preliminary reports that became frozen as truth despite later corrections. A mother's grief so profound it could not accommodate the resurrection it had prayed for. June 1951. The same farmhouse, the same gravel drive. A car pulled up. California plates bright in the afternoon sun. Caroline stood on the porch, her sister beside her for support, as the doors opened. Marcus emerged first, taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had shrunk. He moved with a slight limp, evidence of wounds that had healed imperfectly. Behind him came Anne, holding the hand of a small boy with Marcus's eyes and her gentle smile. They stood for a moment in tableau, separated by 6 years and 6 feet of space. Then Marcus took a step forward, and another, and Caroline found herself moving too. They met in the middle of the drive, and when Marcus folded her into his arms, Caroline felt the solidity of him, the undeniable reality of breath and heartbeat and living warmth. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry I didn't know you." Marcus held her tighter. "You know me now," he said. "That's what matters." Young Thomas approached shyly, guided by Anne. He looked up at Caroline with serious dark eyes. "Are you my grandma?" he asked. Caroline knelt in the gravel, heedless of her dress, and took her grandson's small hands in hers. "I am," she said. "I've been waiting to meet you for such a long time." The weeks that followed were a gradual reconstruction of family. Marcus walked the fields of his childhood, showing his son the creek where he had fished, the barn where he had hidden from chores, the oak tree he had climbed despite his mother's warnings. Anne learned Caroline's recipes in the farmhouse kitchen, their conversation building bridges between the life Marcus had lived here and the one he had built in California. In quiet moments, Marcus and Caroline spoke about the lost years. He told her about his wounds, about the confusion of waking in hospital after hospital, never sure which country he was in. He told her about the liberation of the POW camp, about the skeletal men who had wept at the sight of American uniforms. He told her about the moment he realized his mother did not recognize him, the peculiar agony of being called a liar when speaking the deepest truth. Caroline told him about the memorial service, about the neighbors who had brought casseroles, about the finality of folding the flag. She told him about the decision to sell the house, to move away from memories that had become unbearable. She told him about the young man on the porch in the snow, how she had seen him in dreams afterward, always wondering if she had been too harsh with a confused veteran, never imagining he had been exactly who he claimed. "The letter would have changed everything," Caroline said one evening, watching Thomas play in the yard. "If it had arrived in December 1944, when you wrote it, I would have known you were alive. I would have been waiting." Marcus nodded slowly. "But it didn't arrive. And we can't change that. We can only decide what to do with now." He stayed for 3 weeks, longer than he had planned. Before he left, he made Caroline promise to visit California in the autumn. "I want Thomas to know his grandmother," he said. "I want him to grow up understanding that family can survive anything, even the things that try to tear it apart." Caroline watched the car disappear down the drive, California bound, carrying her son into a life that existed beyond her daily sight. But this time, the goodbye held no grief. This time, she knew exactly where he was going, and she knew he would return. The 1944 letter remained in the wooden box, but Caroline moved it to the top, above the telegram, above the Purple Heart, above the memorial flag. It was evidence, she decided, of a fundamental truth, that hope could be right even when certainty was wrong, that the dead could sometimes return, that bureaucracy could fail, but families could endure. She wrote to Marcus weekly, letters that arrived promptly in San Diego, their two-way correspondence creating the relationship that had been interrupted by war and confusion, and the unbridgeable certainty of official death. She learned to think of Anne as a daughter, to anticipate Thomas's growth through the photographs that arrived regularly, documenting a childhood she could now participate in from a distance. Other mothers in the county heard the story, passed along through the efficient network of rural gossip. Some came to Caroline seeking their own miracles, clutching old telegrams, asking if she thought their sons might also be alive somewhere, misidentified, unable to prove themselves. Caroline had to tell them gently that lightning rarely struck twice, that her son's survival had been anomaly, not template. But she understood their hope, recognized in their faces the same desperate prayer she had abandoned too soon. The Army's bureaucratic efficiency, which had failed so profoundly, made perfunctory amends. Official letters arrived apologizing for the errors in Marcus's records, for the delay in mail delivery, for the miscommunication that had resulted in his presumed death status. The letters were carefully worded to avoid explicit admission of fault, protecting the institution while acknowledging that something had gone terribly wrong. Marcus wrote back to Caroline about the letters, his tone philosophical. They were doing their best in impossible circumstances, he said. Millions of men moving across continents, records kept in tents and trucks, mail traveling through war zones. The real miracle is that the system worked as often as it did. Caroline kept his perspective in mind when the reporters came, drawn by the human interest story of a son returned from official death. She declined most interviews, uncomfortable with the attention. But she spoke to one journalist, hoping that someone, somewhere, might read the story and think twice before dismissing a stranger who claimed an impossible identity. The article ran in newspapers across Indiana and parts of the Midwest. Caroline received letters from other families touched by similar confusion, though none quite as dramatic as her own. One woman wrote about her husband, declared dead in the Philippines, who had returned 18 months after his funeral, only to find she had remarried. Another told of a brother, reported killed at Normandy, who had been a German prisoner of war for 11 months before liberation revealed the identification mistake. These stories, Caroline realized, were the shadow side of war's bureaucracy. For every soldier correctly accounted for, there was someone lost in the administrative shuffle, their fate uncertain, their families caught between hope and grief. The telegram that had destroyed her world had been sent in good faith, based on the best information available. That it had been wrong did not make it malicious. That it had nearly cost her everything made it no less tragic. Autumn 1951. Caroline boarded a westbound train, her first journey beyond Indiana in 2 decades. She carried a small suitcase and a heart full of nervous anticipation. San Diego was an abstraction made real through her son's letters, a place she had imagined but never seen. Marcus met her at the station, Thomas bouncing with excitement beside him. The California sun felt different from the Indiana light Caroline knew. Brighter somehow, less filtered. The city sprawled in directions that made her farm-trained sense of distance feel inadequate. But the house Marcus brought her to felt immediately like home. Anne had prepared the guest room with careful attention, and Thomas insisted on showing his grandmother every toy, every book, every treasure of his 4-year-old existence. Caroline settled into their routine, learning the rhythms of her son's daily life, understanding finally how he had survived the years of separation. She stayed for 6 weeks, longer than planned, reluctant to leave this newly discovered country of her son's present life. She learned the streets of their neighborhood, the names of their friends, the details that transformed California from distant abstraction to lived reality. She watched Marcus interact with his son, seeing in his patience and tenderness the boy he had been before war had complicated everything. On her last evening, Marcus and Caroline sat on the porch while Anne put Thomas to bed. The Pacific was miles away, but Caroline swore she could smell it in the air, a salt tang promise of vastness. "I used to be angry," Marcus said quietly. "When you turned me away that first time. When you returned my letters unopened. I felt like you'd chosen grief over me, like maybe I'd died over there after all, and what came back wasn't worth claiming." Caroline reached for his hand. "And now?" "Now I understand that grief is its own kind of truth," Marcus said. "You weren't wrong to mourn me. The army said I was dead. The evidence supported it. The only mistake was that reality disagreed with the paperwork." He smiled faintly. "Besides, I got Anne and Thomas out of the detour. That's not nothing." They sat in comfortable silence as the California evening deepened around them. Somewhere in the house, Thomas laughed at something his mother said. A dog barked in a neighboring yard. Life continued in its ordinary, miraculous way. "The letter arrived 7 years late," Caroline said. "But it kept its promise. You came home. Just not the way either of us expected." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I was always coming home, Ma. The letter just took the scenic route." Caroline returned to Indiana with photographs and memories, with Anne's recipes written in careful script, with Thomas's drawings folded carefully in her luggage. The farmhouse felt emptier now, but the emptiness was different from the hollowness of grief. This was simply distance, the ordinary separation of family spread across a continent. It could be bridged with letters and telephone calls and visits. It was not permanent. She established a routine of Sunday evening phone calls, talking with Marcus and Anne and Thomas each week. She sent packages for Thomas's birthday, for Christmas, for no reason, except that she saw something that made her think of her grandson. She planned another visit for the following summer, already anticipating the reunion. The wooden box in the hall closet remained, but its contents had been reorganized. The 1944 letter stayed on top, but beside it now were photographs of living family. Marcus in his California home, Anne in the kitchen, Thomas playing in a yard that never saw Indiana snow. The memorial flag was still there, still folded with military precision, but it had become artifact rather than truth, evidence of a grief that had transformed into gratitude. Other families in the county still spoke of Caroline's miracle, though time was beginning to soften the sharp edges of the story. The postman who had delivered the letter had dined out on the tale for months before moving on to other deliveries, other dramas. The neighbors who had witnessed Caroline's grief and subsequent joy gradually shifted their focus to newer scandals and celebrations. But Caroline carried the story forward in her own quiet way. She became the person other war mothers sought when the Army's certainties did not align with their hopes. She could not promise them miracles, but she could offer the hard-won understanding that official truth was sometimes provisional, that bureaucracy could fail, that hope was not always foolish even when evidence suggested otherwise. Years accumulated. Thomas grew into a boy who knew his grandmother through visits and letters, who understood that family could exist across distance. Marcus's limp faded as middle age settled over him, though the scars remained, visible evidence of wounds that had nearly killed him and definitely transformed him. Anne became the daughter Caroline had never had, their relationship built not on shared history, but on mutual commitment to the family they had assembled from chaos. The 1944 letter aged in its box, the paper yellowing, the ink fading slightly despite Caroline's careful storage. But its words remained legible, the promise intact. "I'll be home, Ma. That's what matters. I'll be home." It had taken 7 years for the letter to arrive. It had taken another 6 years for Caroline to truly receive it, to understand what it meant, to accept that the dead could return, and that bureaucratic certainty could be overruled by living reality. But the promise had been kept. Marcus had come home. The timing had been wrong, the path had been circuitous, but the destination had been reached. Caroline Mitchell lived to see her grandson graduate high school, to hold 2 more grandchildren born in the 1950s, to celebrate her son's 40th birthday in that same California house where she had first learned to think of San Diego as home. She died in 1968, peacefully, in Indiana, with Marcus beside her, having finally accepted that sometimes resurrection was possible, that official death could be reversed, that a letter 7 years late could still change everything. The wooden box passed to Marcus after his mother's death. He opened it carefully, looking through the contents. The telegram that had declared him dead, the Purple Heart awarded posthumously, then reassigned to a living recipient, the memorial flag from a funeral that had mourned an empty coffin. And on top, preserved with obvious care, the letter he had written from a Belgian field hospital in November 1944, promising his mother he would come home. He read his own words, written by a 22-year-old soldier who could not have imagined the journey ahead. The promise had been simple: I will return. The fulfillment had been complex: separation, rejection, rebuilding, eventual reconciliation. But the promise had been kept. Marcus placed the letter back in the box, added a photograph of his mother from her last visit to California, and closed the lid gently. The story was complete now, the circle closed. A letter sent in wartime had arrived in peacetime. A son declared dead had returned to life. A mother's grief had transformed into a grandmother's joy. The timing had been wrong, but the ending had been right. And in the end, Timing was just another variable in the equation. What mattered was that the letter had arrived. What mattered was that the promise had been kept. What mattered was that home, however delayed, had finally been reached. If you have enjoyed this story, tell YouTube to send you similar stories by subscribing to this channel, liking the video, and leaving a comment.